participate in a general context. Okay, so a lot of what we study in the project has to do with that distinction, and we try to basically make that distinction very explicit in the way we describe solutions and then make them available through the catalog. So, and I'll finish on this. We have, as a result, to pursue that goal, we have those large forms of activity in the project. Some have to do with understanding this societal resilience, through a variety of means. Some have to do with identifying existing solutions, for example, from the literature, but also some interviews that have been conducted or surveys. And then synthesizing that knowledge, joining that knowledge into basically a way to support interaction with the population in the form of this knowledge platform, which is an information resource basically for aimed at authorities or emergency organizations that might be interested in implementing and in identifying such solutions. I'm sorry, I can hear some noise. Please. I'm not sure where this noise is coming from, but anyway, yes. And then finally, of course, validating that we are indeed, that the knowledge platform is producing the kind of results that we want. That is, it is informative. It is helping authorities and first responders to find inspiration and find ways in which they can improve interaction with the population, and also in conducting exercises. Okay, so today we'll have just a partial view of all of that. We'll focus especially on this aspect of understanding societal resilience through cases, and we will discuss some of where we are, the status of where we are relative to the catalog of solutions. So that's the project. That's the plan for today. Okay, I'll stop here. Any question relative to this so far before we dive into the details of the cases? Then Jan, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So I'm happy to talk to you today about our cases, the different case studies we do in Engage, and I want to do so with a special focus on what we have called spontaneous volunteers. First of all, I would like to show you a little bit our cases. Some of them you already know because they were global catastrophes. Others you might have heard because we met earlier on and talked about that. But I think it's good to get into the cases again, so to see what exactly we're working about, and even to get a little bit immersed, so we can really understand those cases and what it feels to be in the situation and to act to it. So let's start with it. So be it a camping site, organizing to rescue victims and deliver first aid during the Utøya terror attack in Norway. Or as another example, it might be labor organizations spontaneously creating camps after the earthquake of Aquila in 2009, or community organizations after the Sendai tsunami that self-evacuate. Normally after crisis, and this is well documented and we all know it, people do things. First of all, because they're victims, but also because they want to cope with this event and help others. So, in inverted commas, normal people spontaneously organize. And for us, it was important to understand this. We try to do this by different means, as Matthew just mentioned. Also, we have done surveys. We speak, of course, to first responders, but one of the means we use is to make in-depth case studies on 7 types of crises localized on different scales. So the idea was to take cases that reflect a specific type of disaster or crisis, as you can see, earthquake, flash floods, wildfires, etc. And at the same time, they are differently localized. Some of them are in a very specific spot. Some of them concern almost the country. So it's on a very different scales. And what we do in those case studies is, besides of literature analysis and expert interviews, we try to speak with the spontaneous volunteers, those who did something, who coped with the disaster, with the crisis, and influenced others. We try to focus on several things, but maybe for today, let's focus on 3 of them. Coping actions, so what people actually do, the stuff they do afterwards, their motivations, how do they justify and reference what they're doing, and how this can contribute to societal resilience, which is our guiding concept. So we want to enhance it, want to make it better so we can, after crisis, leap forward. Let's have a look at those case studies. So the goal is to assess and to improve societal resilience. And the idea was to take 7 historical case studies. So case studies in the past, where we have ample data, which are kind of easily accessible as well, and which are normally centered around the event itself, which makes it more easy to understand what spontaneous means in that case. So it's not long-term afterwards, it's not long-term preparing beforehand, it's the crisis level itself, our scope. The idea was to make comparative approach, so that's why we have 7, to look what's at play at different of those cases, and to do it by a content analysis coding of those interviews in order to understand what concepts are used, how the situation were described, and what is the sense-making of the people in those situations. How do they justify what they did? Like I said, expert interviews with volunteers, and document analysis guided our research. We have done those 7 cases. So there's first the Utøya terror attack of 2011, the L'Aquila earthquake of 2009, the Swedish wildfires of 2018, the Tohoku tsunami of 2011, and linked to that, of course, the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident of the same year, and flash floods in the Negev desert in Israel in 2018, and the failed terrorist attack on the Thales train in 2015. So let's look a little bit closer to those cases, starting with the Utøya terror attack. I guess you all know this case because it's a really major terrorist attack, which was in international news, but just to remind ourselves what happened. So after setting a car bomb in the middle of Oslo in July 2011, the 22nd of July 2011, and killing by this bomb 8 people, and injuring 2009, the assailant, Anders Breivik, a right-wing terrorist, moved to an island for a second attack, the island of Utøya. At around 5:30, the assailants started to shoot on this island, where the youth wing of the Norwegian Labour Party held their annual summer camp. Armed with a pistol and a semi-automatic rifle, he shot and killed 69 and injured 33 camp participants. The modus operandi was to move around the island, shooting and killing youngsters and those who tried to save themselves by hiding in the woods, inside buildings, or trying to swim ashore. Based on emergency calls from the victims themselves, the police initiated rescue operations. This involved local police and national special forces, the so-called Delta Force. The attempt to come to the rescue was delayed by several factors. This included insufficient knowledge of the island's location. They did not coordinate well between the local police and the Delta Force. They were insufficiently staffed, and weak communication systems led also to further delay. And finally, there was a focus on the safety of the emergency personnel themselves before getting to the victims. So the formal disaster management, crisis management in that case, was delayed. And so during this attack, several non-affiliated volunteers in the area, at a local camping site, in nearby houses, residents, tourists, took initiatives to help rescuing these young teenagers who tried to escape from the island. These initiatives were both spontaneous and self-organized and on a large scale. They used their boats to pick up survivors from the water, provided first aid, medical treatment, including life-saving care, and transported injured survivors to nearby medical facilities. And by doing this, they were willing to expose themselves to danger, since the shooter was also targeting boats who tried to advance to the island. So we have a case where we have an important informal disaster management, rescue operations, who is done by tourists and residents because the police came late or relatively late to the island. That's what is interesting for us in this case. Let's jump to the next one, the Aquila earthquake of 2009. This earthquake largely destroyed the historical city of L'Aquila in the Abruzzo region of central Italy. Occurred in April 6 in 2009, killed 308 citizens, injured 1,500, and left more than 67,000 residents of L'Aquila homeless. Using state-level emergency planning, Italian authorities prohibited access to the historical city center, which was considered as dangerous, so-called red zone, and some highly damaged neighborhoods. The Civil Protection Agency then relocated 32,000 citizens of L'Aquila to hotels and non-affected houses as part of a mandatory process. And 35,000 were placed in tents in camps for up to 8 months, so a long period of time. The camps were organized and managed by the Civil Protection Agency. But at the same time, this is the interesting part for us, we had self-organized housing structures that emerged parallel to the official camps. In rural communities surrounding L'Aquila, municipalities collaborate with organizations and also individuals organized housing in spaces where nobody lived or improvised shelters. So this is interesting for us because the slow reconstruction process took until 2015 to finish reconstruction, and the lack of emergency housing led to a lot of informal shelter and housing distribution. And this is interesting for us because this was often organized spontaneously by people at the site. I'm coming back to it. Next case would be the Swedish wildfires of 2018. So in May and June 2018, a historical heat wave affected Sweden. The first wildfires appeared in May. At one moment, we had 50 active hotspots in June, and 250 square kilometers were affected all over Sweden, but mostly in the middle of Sweden. But all over Sweden, you had wildfires. The reasons are diverse. Disposable barbecues in combination with the unusual climate conditions, that's very hot, facilitated this disaster. The largest wildfires were in central Sweden, where you had 85 square kilometers. Whereas the wildfires were initially under control, the situation, and especially the fact that it went over 2 months, overpowered the Swedish firefighters in June. And international assistance was requested via European Civil Protection, and you had firefighters coming from Norway, Denmark, Finland, Germany, France, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, and Portugal. And during this second stage of the crisis, so late June, middle June, rural areas had to be evacuated, large areas in different municipalities. Also because there was a lot of smoke production, so there were health issues at hand. It is, until today, the biggest wildfires in Sweden's modern history. And over the long run, so there is the lack of manpower for firefighters, as well as trained resources. So there were also sometimes logistical issues by providing sufficient resources, shelter, etc., to the evacuated and also to some of the first responders. What is interesting for us in this case is the high participation of volunteers. So a lot of people who spontaneously on the municipal level in rural areas helped, and we were trying to get in touch with those. The next case you know very well, so I will be quite brief on that. So the Tohoku earthquake in 2011, the big tsunami who devastated 500 square kilometers of Japan's Pacific coast. You had 600,000 people who were directly affected, and 22,000, according to the count. So immediately 15,895 victims were killed. On the long run, you had 22,990 persons linked to indirect causes who died from this tsunami, the largest tsunami in Japan's history. And what is interesting for us was the organization of large-scale evacuations, who were often led by residents spontaneously. Of course, you had alert systems, you had alarms, you had authorities who were helping, but the massive amount of those evacuations were organized by citizens. Next case, and linked to that, the nuclear accident triggered by the tsunami. the Fukushima Daiichi accident, as it's called. Well, the earthquake had already cut the power to the nuclear facility, and then the tsunami largely devastated the auxiliary pumps, which led to 3 nuclear meltdowns. And linked to that, and independently from the tsunami, 154,000 people had to be evacuated. Here again, what is interesting for us is those spontaneous evacuations, but also when citizens started to take up their Geiger counters and measure radiations by themselves, trying to map areas which were affected. And this case was very interesting to us. So how did these people organize to do something which we not normally associate with highly sophisticated disaster management? The next case is the Negev flash floods in 2018, when in the Israeli Negev desert, 10 teenagers were hiking, organized by a youth organization, Israeli one, who was insufficiently prepared for a quick change in weather, so heavy rain, which resulted in flash floods, killing 10 of the teenage hikers and injuring 2. The rescue operations were mainly done by professionals, and were quite quickly and efficiently could the bodies and the affected people be localized and evacuated from the crisis situations. But what is interesting for us is here on a different level, the organizations who organized the hiking reorganized following this event, to completely reorganized to prevent different types of those disaster risks from happening, and also other types of risk, more social ones. So this event had a triggering effect on internal reorganizations. So this case allows us a little bit to change the level, the scale, by looking in that case more on the organizational side and less on individuals. And the last case is the failed terrorist attack in a train connecting Paris and Brussels in 2015, when a 26-year-old armed with the Kalashnikov assault rifle boarded this high-speed train, went to the toilet in order to prepare for a terrorist attack, was intercepted by a passenger who tried to disarm him, and helped by a French-American soldier who was on holidays in France, who assisted him and took possession of his assault rifle. The attacker managed to use another weapon, a pistol, and shoots the French-American in the back. But they result in retrieving this rifle and fix him to the floor, while others helped in maintaining the attacker until a train driver and later on security professionals take care of the situation. What is interesting here is that the assailant was overwhelmed and restrained by passengers, diverse one with diverse profiles. And also we have good access to this case because the following court case made it possible to have a lot of verbatim by the people who were in this incident. So in this case, for example, we didn't need to use interviews. We have really extensive documentation on the motivations and the precise actions of each one involved in this incident. So those are just as a reminder, our cases. And the idea was to focus first on spontaneous volunteers, and then link to that, how can we understand societal resilience if we focus on this citizen participation in crisis management. So what is interesting to see in all those cases is, of course, and that's why we chose them, is an important participation of volunteers that did not participate in organized forms of volunteering. So this is not volunteers who were trained beforehand, who prepared for the situation and activated in some sort during the crisis situation. Those were people who were just there and reacted to the event. Well, that's more important for us. So in all cases, you have residents or bystanders that, and this is important, effectively cope with the crisis. So the cases we have here show all an informal crisis management that worked. And what is also interesting to see is that these coping actions somehow coexisted and only sometimes interacted with the formal disaster management. So this is not necessarily a cooperation. And this is interesting for us since we want to think about it systematically. How can we enhance those interactions and how can we make it more easy and more accessible that citizens help in those types of crises? So it's interesting to see that here we have often cases where it somehow coexisted. So we can, by looking at those cases, maybe have some conclusions on how we can enhance this situation. When we look at the literature in order to understand what did disaster studies tell us until today, how can we think of those volunteers? There's the notion of emerging groups, a very old one from 1980s, who try to understand them as something collective, those normally as groups always. But here we have also individuals. What you also can find often is the notion of civil society participation, but this is also not entirely fitting because we don't have a really highly organized civil society that engages in this informal disaster management. We often have individuals, we have loosely organized, so civil society doesn't seem quite fitting for our cases. And then, yes, we have volunteers, but the notion of volunteering is always also a notion seen from the side of an informal and official disaster management, people coming to help, so they're volunteering in something that is already going on. It's not entirely fitting, but for the moment we stick with this concept because we have here people who just react independently of what the professionals do. And then there's the question of spontaneity. We get into that. So what does it motivate? Is it not somehow also planned? We don't have also the professional skills who come into play that exist beforehand? Is not there maybe a first responder who's just in holidays and who will activate at the situation, but is this really spontaneous? Also, we are going to look closer into that. To do so, I would like to look at some of the key findings from each of the case. And I want to structure it by looking first on motivations. So what did people tell us in interviews or to others in interviews, why they did what they did, and then focus on what they did, on coping actions. So, and if we start with the Utøya terror attack of 2011 and look at motivations, it's interesting to see that what is referenced by respondents is the importance of mutual trust, the fact that you feel connected to those people you're helping in a society in Norway, which is normally described as having a low power distance, low social inequality, and yes, generalized trust. So trust is something that comes up when we speak with respondents. What is also mentioned is when asked why they went in those dangerous situations and helped others is the notion of reciprocity. So I could be in the situation and I would like somebody to help me, so I will help the person in distress. And then we have a lot of involuntary volunteers, in inverted commas, in the sense that people struggle to describe exactly what is the main motivation, because in the situation they're just reacting to the fact. It is not something which is thoroughly planned beforehand. It is not a moral discussion in their mind. They react because they're there and the situation presents itself and demands immediate action. So it activates, one could say, internalized behavior, something they were trained for, something they know, something they are used to, something that corresponds to some internalized values that makes you act without even thinking. If we look at the coping actions, we can distinguish in this case between different stages. The first stage, people getting out, helping the teenagers to go to land, applying for first aid and care, is individual. So there are individuals' decisions. People are aware of the situation. They heard people shooting. They get the news. They conclude something strange is going on the island, and so they act pro-socially, yes, so towards the collective, but on an individual level. What is interesting here is that this is happening task-oriented. So they are doing one thing. They're organizing a boat. Or later on, they would help people get to shore. So it's really based on one specific task, and it doesn't have this cross-cutting dimension which you would see in an official disaster management with a division of labor, etc. So it's really task-oriented. They do one thing. In the second stage, when people come together, notably at the shore where the victims arrive and need immediate help, it is unorganized, but people start to adapt to each other's actions, still task-oriented, by talking, by conducting several actions together. It's not really something we could call organized, but it is already going into the direction of a collective action, not only individually based. And it's still task-oriented, and the tasks are basic needs. So nothing complicated, nothing which goes over the site itself, but it's about administering help, getting blankets, etc. And then the third stage, you have organized but improvised way to help, especially if not only the immediate bleeding wound, but also psychological elements come into play, where you had more reflective, more organized way to attend to the victims. We can, of course, come back to the different case studies later on in discussion. I'm just going ahead with the next one. And so after the conclusion, I think we can revisit each one of them if you like. If you look at the case of the Aquila earthquake and what we see when we talked to respondents, we have different motivations that are mentioned. A very common one is the one of family or friendship ties. So we have to help loved others who are in the situation, or you know somebody from Aquila, even though you're not right there. So there is a felt proximity that makes you act. So you act because you want to help, but a concrete person, somebody you know, somebody who might be there, or because you have a concrete link to it. You used to live in Aquila. So there is this idea of being connected to the place, being close to it, proximity, because you have a concrete social link. Then there's, of course, also the notion of reciprocity. We especially spoke to students who mention and reference that, well, they want to help other students because they are also students and they could be students in the situation. So this framework of reciprocity is also something that comes up quite often in our interviews. And then a more general, not a very concrete one, but a more general idea of helping those in need. So an idea of charity, of heroism. So we need to do something because people are suffering, but people in plural, not concrete ones, but people are suffering, sometimes motivated by things you saw or heard, and then people would engage. Those three motivations appear in this case. And then there is also, and this is distinct from, in this case, from the others, there is also the idea of organizing alternatives to what is sometimes perceived as complicated official disaster management. There are political initiatives. So, and this is often linked to the fact that people who engage in these organizing alternatives would mention their prior socialization in political collectives, in trade unions, etc. This would be a fourth motivation. If we look at the coping actions, we can see very diverse types of actions. You have something which is interesting for us in the rural areas, in the mountain villages surrounding L'Aquila. You have specific spots that organize housing. Typically, this could be a pub, a bar, where one person knows the village, knows where people might have vacancies, where people might help, and will bring others together so this help can be organized. So one individual behavior that facilitated by a specific place where people know they could find help. You go to a pub because it's a central place in a village, for example, and you know the owner, so in this specific role, and you know he has probably networks that can help you. Something you can call a spatial fix. So in order for the spontaneous volunteers to appear, you needed in those cases a specific place where you meet. The same could go for the other example, building a refugee camp. So we had a trade union who organized a refugee camp, and that mobilized the organizational resources, but also the mutual trust you had in this organization. So it was only possible because people know beforehand how they interact with others in this organization, how the communication ways would work and function, and could organize this refugee camp. The same goes for another example, which is not on the slide, which is a local radio and also a trauma group that tries to administer psychological aid. Often, if we look closer to these events, we see those were people who knew each other beforehand and activated their networks, their personal individual networks, but also often in the case of an organization. And then you have also the fact that you organize this with the prior knowledge and skills, like in the case before, but it's also built on shared experience. People who were together in a camp and wanted to make another one because what they lived on a daily basis. So also you have this this way to organize yourself, to be spontaneous as a reaction to what you just lived. And in this case, the reaction would be to some part of the official disaster management. If you look at the Swedish wildfire, the case is a little bit different. And here I took extracts of interviews we did with municipal workers. So you would say, well, professionals, right? Those who help because it's their job. But what was interesting when we approached those different municipalities that evacuated during the Swedish wildfires, that most of the people who were, yes, in an official position in a municipality, but not at all linked to crisis management or to the question of the overall organization of the community. We had one person who was responsible for sport events, and he will start to engage in fire extinction management. And he will do this for weeks and weeks and weeks. But what is interesting in this case is he will not describe himself as a volunteer. He sees it as part of his function, even though it was mainly in his free time, and even though his normal job profile does not correspond at all to the fact of keeping a fire from coming up again. And if we ask those persons, and we had several ones who are in the same profile, why do you do this? And the first notion is I would just kept going. I started in an emergency situation, starting in May. A wildfire appears. Somebody was calling the municipality. I was the only one there. I responded. I was asked to do that on my work time as a replacement. And I just kept going. I never stopped. So you see, there's not really the intentionality strongly, yeah, I do this because I want to help others, but it's just you take a task and you will bring it to its end. And since it's not finished, well, you don't finish it neither. So you have sometimes those positions who come from a formal role to an informal way to deal with a disaster. The same goes for the second quote, there was nobody else. So a sense of duty linked to the official role. And of course, the proximity, I was there, the others not. And so a sense of obligation to do this, even though it's in your free time, even though it doesn't correspond to your role, but something also linked to a certain profession, of course. So it's not a coincidence that those are municipal workers, but well, it's still noteworthy that they did this in their free time. And also something which was coming back a lot is this idea, while doing it over 2 months, I learned so many things. I learned a lot. And this motivated me to go on. So something would maybe not have had all right from the beginning. If you think of crisis and why do people volunteer, we would think of some heroic act. And of course, there is very an important amount of altruism in it. But this was also sometimes described as kind of a trade-off. I help and I get something new, a new skill, new contacts, etc. So it was interesting to see when people were asked, why did you go there every day over 2 months, is also, yeah, because I got something back. It was useful for me. If you look at the coping actions, you can see what I just mentioned. There had been a lot of fire management done by city officials, and they experienced their volunteering as a kind of a continuum from their normal professional roles. What we also could see, and this is in other cases, was the importance of local knowledge, especially since a lot of those wildfires were in remote areas. It was not easy to get there. Most of the times, firefighters knew very well where they were situated based on satellite images, etc. But the problem was a question of access and routes and how to get there on the shortest way. And there you had a lot of locals who live in those remote areas who know it very well, who helped to navigate it. And so neighborhood organizations were also very important while the firefighting was going on over 2 months. So people who saw that the resource became scarce started to organize because they were living there. Let's go on to the Tohoku tsunami of 2011. What is interesting here about the motivations is that a lot of the volunteering did not appear as a volunteering, but as a victimhood. So people were affected by the disasters and started to organize people around themselves. But they started the fact of helping by being a victim first. well, as you heard and as you know, this tsunami affected massively whole landscapes. So it is analytically impossible to distinguish from somebody who's a victim and somebody who's just a helper. So it's important, I think, in this case, to highlight the very blurry boundaries between being a victim and volunteering and being spontaneous volunteer. And what also was interesting in that case, that of course, in Japan, who has a strong accent on disaster drills, but also a cultural framework, especially in the north of the Pacific coast, that enables rapid action, especially linked to evacuations, because this has been trained beforehand, because this has been repeated in cultural traditions and stories, etc. So people often mentioned that they knew how to behave and they have behaved immediately because they have interiorized certain types of behavior linked to drills and specific traditional practices. So if you focus on the coping actions, we can see evacuations were central. This is mainly what people did in the immediate aftermath after the tsunami. And then the community organization for those who were rescued, who were on higher ground, spontaneously resources were organized. Sometimes they were, of course, organized resources, but there was always some logistical elements that were taken care of. And this was normally often done by community leaders, so people who had beforehand this role. The case is interesting to see that culture matters because, like I mentioned, the area is divided in two, the southern part of the Pacific coast in Japan and the northern part. And they are different in the sense that the southern part is mainly composed of plains, whereas the northern part is in a very mountain-like area. And so it is different in the sense that you can easily go in the northern part on higher ground. You just go up the hill, normally you're safe. Whereas in the southern part, you need to go to specific locations, to specific houses, skyscrapers, higher buildings, where you can be safe. This led to the fact that in the southern part of the Pacific coast in Japan, you have often organized evacuation routes, organized by the state, organized by local communities, whereas in the northern part, where it seemed less necessary in the sense that you can easily go to a higher ground, even though it's still, of course, highly necessary, you had more cultural practices who are linked to that. Also because in the small valleys of this northern area, the tsunami goes up very fast, so it's much more quicker than in the plain areas. So you have to act much faster. And so you can see that in both regions, you have very different ways to do it based on cultural practices. If we speak about the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear accident, what is interesting is the self-evacuations. And why did people do this before the official evacuation order came? Something, of course, that happens often in crisis, but why in this specific case? And what is visible if we look in the literature, if we speak to people, is that it is often a sense of self-preservation and the fact that having a family you can go to. And also this family calling you and asking, don't you want to leave? There is a dangerous situation. We can accommodate you. So a lot of the people who left their homes during this time did so because they had family links to another region where they felt they could be safe. And often in that case, duty is mentioned as an important explanation why people became active. The idea that you have a special role in a collective and you have to take care of others because it's a social duty. So internalized values. Well, the self-evocation often started as an individual action. So people started to gather around their family and start to leave. And then often in a lot of description how this led to a whole neighborhood leaving. So one individual makes a decision for self-preservation and affects a whole area to do the same. So we have something which is not considered as, in this case, a duty or altruistic motivation, but which has collective implications. This is interesting. And I mentioned earlier the case of self-organized radiation measurements in order to make alert systems and maps. This was often based on prior skills. So you need to have a Geiger counter and you need how to use it. So people who already had some knowledge of natural science gathered around themselves groups of volunteers who organized those radiation measurements. Oh, sorry. In the case of negative floods, what is interesting in this, I mentioned the organizational angle, is to see how legal accountability, because there's a process afterwards, and also the feeling of social responsibility brings this organization to change its way linked to one singular event. Dramatic one, right? But still, how does this affect an organization to spontaneously make a really wide organizational reform? And as I said, we had a professional search and rescue, but what is interesting here is the organizational coping on the long run, how this affects the organization. The last case, the Thales train attack. Well, as you saw, individual action was motivated by professional skills. The person who took care of the attacker, the second person, could notice the sound of loading rifle because he was a soldier. And also, since combat was involved, we can clearly see that professional skills played a role, especially because the persons, when asked, why did you do it, also described kind of an automated process linked to the skills they had. So I knew what to do, so I did it. So the skills seem to motivate the action that followed. And then, of course, what is the motivation by the passengers that later helped is just they were close. So people described the assailant was falling on their feet and somebody was addressing them, and well, he was just there, so they acted and hold him down. So proximity in that case and not some strong intention explains us why people acted. We have 3 stages of the event. Well, the assailant was disarmed, was fixated, and since one of the person was wounded, blessed, the others helped them. So we can see again this very task-oriented one thing. We do one thing. We disarm the assailant. Once he's disarmed, we fixate him. Once he's fixated, we will take care of the person that is wounded. So really task-oriented, what I mentioned earlier. Okay, let's sum it up and then discuss. First point, spontaneous volunteers are effective. That's not self-evident. A lot of cases, of course, where they're not necessarily affected, but in those cases, it worked. Intentionality plays somehow a limited role. Spontaneous volunteer, we would think of somebody spontaneous wanting to help, but as we saw in a lot of the cases, it's often internalized behavior, not necessarily a big intention. Their coping is often neither organized nor centralized. It's based on specific tasks that they perform. These tasks often involve basic needs. And then finally, while doing those basic needs, social networks branch out. So people try to mobilize their personal individual resources, adapt to others doing similar tasks, and then you have a collective organization. The interactions with formal disaster management in all our 7 cases are rather rare and happen in specific instances. Most of the time, both informal and formal disaster management kind of coexist. One explanation could be that task-oriented coping networks do not necessarily correspond well to a very functional division of labor and disaster management, that you have highly professionalized disaster manager who do work in a specific task, which does not necessarily correspond to the task that the citizens are doing. And as you saw, the limits between professional roles, organized and unorganized volunteering, or volunteers and victims are kind of fluid. So the position can change over a crisis event or cannot be clear at all. You can have both roles at the same time. So far from me speaking to you, thank you very much. Now I would like to engage a bit of conversation with you. So the first thing would, of course, be, do you have any questions about that? And then maybe in the second instance, do our findings correspond to your experiences? I can see Patricia.
Yeah, can you hear me? Can you see me?
I can hear you perfectly well, and I see you as well.
Wonderful. First of all, congratulations. This was an absolutely amazing presentation by both of you, Jan and Mathieu, before. Okay, I'm really, really excited to see this work. Not least because it's work on a topic I've been working on since 2015. So I'm feeling extremely at home here, and even more so, Mathieu, you're sitting in Trondheim, is that correct? So part of my work was in northern Norway and Svalbard specifically, not only, but one of my cases was Svalbard. I have been working on something called informal disaster governance. And I think that, it's very close to what you do in that it's a more encompassing term for, a lot of the stuff that you were talking about here, just not only, okay? And I do have a few questions/comments. One is, you are talking about proximity, and I would like to encourage you to consider the term propinquity instead of proximity. When you look at informal actions, proximity seems a very intuitive term to use, but it turns out to be highly problematic. We have informal actions that happen, where there's no physical proximity, and we have, and vice versa. When you look at the term propinquity, it encompasses an emotional and physical proximity, without necessarily presuming certain things that the term proximity does, or limiting it to certain things that the term proximity does. Okay, so just think about that term perhaps. The one thing that I find a bit troubling is the use of the volunteers. And you said it yourself, right? You looked into it and you looked at the different terms that are being sort of used for that concept of, hey, there's a disaster and there should be the formal system that responds, but that there are actually a lot of informal people who respond. So how do we call them, right? And if you go all the way back to 1918 and to Princess Halifax study, he already has terms for that. In the research that I did, I found 48 different terms that are currently in use in disaster science to denote the same damn thing, right? People acting in disasters who are not mandated officially to act in disasters, okay? The newest term is obviously Michael Glantz's zero order responders. I'm not sure if you're familiar. If you're not, perhaps, look into that. But what troubles me about the use of volunteers is, in my research, part of which was also qualitative, when I spoke to people, to those informal responders in disasters, they really do not appreciate being called volunteers, right? They will tell you, well, why volunteer? I don't volunteer for any organization. And also there is that, independence of action, right? I want my actions to be appreciated. And they're independent of the Red Cross, of the government, of whoever. Actually, in many disasters, those formal organizations came to those informal responders for help, right? So why establish that power dynamic, that hierarchy of saying, well, here's the formal system, here are the superheroes who parachute down into the disaster, and you're the informal guys, so you're volunteers. Volunteers to what exactly? Okay, the BBC, I will send you a link if I find it again. The BBC had a huge expose on that a few years ago, where they went to these so-called spontaneous volunteers, interviewed them years later, and traced literally mental issues that people had years later that were attributed to how they were treated by the formal disaster governance system, called volunteers when they didn't feel like it, and being disregarded and whatnot. So I think it's really important that if those people, and you said, I think in the Sweden case, right, they said, we're not volunteers. Well, then why the heck do we keep calling them volunteers? Let's do better. Let's call them informal actors, right? And the final thing on that, and really connecting to that semantic, is, look, for the past, 30-ish years now, in disaster science, we're talking about disaster governance, right? Disaster governance means nothing else but national and local, and formal and informal, and all of them are, yes, it's fluid, but it's on somewhat equal footing in terms of the value of the contribution, right? So disaster governance just means I have the informal side and I have the formal side and the national and the local and whatever. And all of these are part of the disaster governance system. So again, why establish, why establish that power dynamic and say, well, but you, the informal actors who we now establish every single case study that you showed, right, are so important and are so important irrespective, which is a really important finding that I found in my research too, irrespective of what formal does or does not do. You can have the best formal response, people will act informally anyway. Okay, so why say this is so important and yet we just say that they are volunteers? Okay, I have many little other notes, but I will stop there. I think this will be something for another discussion. However, one thing that I want to just finish with is we are actually publishing a book on this topic with Oxford University Press, and there is a call for chapters for case studies. Okay, right. So if you guys are interested, I'll send you the call for chapters. I'll forward that to you, and perhaps that's another venue for publication.
We are. Thank you.
I'll stop right there.
Thank you. No, sorry, I will quickly answer and then continue the discussion because I see there are other hands up. But yeah, I completely agree with you. This is mainly a pragmatic choice. Like I said, I have some unease of this term. In other documents, we speak of informal actors. But there might be a little justification still, which is that we also deal with volunteers who call themselves volunteers and like to see them themselves. And we would like to make a continuum from those different notions. And if I talk to them and I would call them informal actor, they wouldn't be, this wouldn't be a term that speaks to them. And I would even say those who don't want to be called volunteers wouldn't also be called informal actors. So I think that there is still a lack of a better term in some sense that is not too academic neither, so it can communicate and speak to the people who take this role. But I completely agree with you. It's always looking on the society from the official part if you call them volunteers, and there's always the power dynamic. I completely agree. So thank you very much for this comment. And also, thank you very much for the comment on proximity. At one moment, I thought about sense of place as an alternative that would also capture this essence of proximity without having this notion. In a sense of place, you have also the emotional and sense making that is part of it. But I don't know the other term. I will look it up. Thank you very much.
If I may, very quickly before I give the floor to Dieter. Yes, so thanks for the same comments as Jan, very useful comments. I like this emphasis on governance because also it allows us to bring in concepts such as polycentric control, which is very important relative to resilience. So yeah, I like it as a as a quick note. So thank you very much.
I see Dieter. Yes.
Yeah, thanks again for the presentations, which I like very much, and also for Patricia for her comments, because I want to add on this. So I'm also working in a sister project called Links, and we are also dealing with getting in touch with volunteers. So my personal distinction is I have three types of volunteers. I firstly start with the affiliate ones because I started as some in a volunteer fire service and end up in a professional fire service. This is what I would call affiliated, which is also a term which is used by FEMA and US. They say I have a definition here. Affiliate volunteers are attached to a recognized volunteer or non-profit organization, and this is important, and are trained for specific disaster response activities. This is the FEMA definition. So then we have the unaffiliated ones. These are those who they are not part of a recognized agency, but nevertheless, they have some specific competences which are useful for disaster management. I think the example the trained ones in Japan would come under unaffiliated, and also the guys who are able to use Geiger equipment and all this stuff, and then you have the spontaneous ones. So, and one can assume that the spontaneous volunteers are those who have no specific training, nevertheless they want to help. And so we have three different types, and in our Links project, we try to get in touch with them by using social media. And you can imagine to get in touch with the spontaneous ones is quite difficult. It's more difficult than the unaffiliated ones, because normally they organize themselves in certain groups and so on and so forth. And the affiliated ones, of course, you have your the official channels to get in touch with the firefighters or EMS personnel and so on. So so in the presentation you often use spontaneous, although some of the examples I would not call them spontaneous volunteers according to my definition. And but I want to raise this issue just to trigger the discussion. So thanks for attention.
Yeah, thank you, Dieter. We also experiment a little bit with these distinctions between affiliated and non-affiliated. It works in some cases very well, but we have also those people who move from one role to another in a very dynamic way, and this is sometimes where it gets challenging. And I think this discussion about the terms we use to call these people who act, who cope, is a very, very fruitful one.
I think it's also important because we are sister projects that we do not use different terms. At least we have to have a short agreement on the project level what at the end of the day how we present our results. So whatever definition at the end will prevail. So, but it would be good to have the same background.
I have Serena.
Okay, hi everyone. First of all, my name is Serena. I'm a new addition to the Engage Ki-CoP, so it's the first time for me to see most of you. So 2 points on my side, and they are both linked to Patrizia and Dieter comments. The first one is that I would encourage you to have a clear definition of volunteers, so what you mean by volunteers, and also be very clear on which dimension are you using to define a volunteer. Okay, so Dieter mentioned one of these, like the affiliation. Affiliation is clearly important. I've sent you the link of one of the, I think it's a white paper I co-authored with the International Federation of Red Cross in, it was 2020. And we basically did a job on, psychological aid to spontaneous volunteers. And we had a bit of trouble in the definition of spontaneous volunteers. So we used some dimension, and one of these was the affiliation, of course, but we also use other aspects. So I don't know if you included in your work this kind of dimension, but if you didn't, I would encourage you to do so, to be more clear about what you mean by volunteers, and also the type of activities that volunteers are engaged in can change along these different dimensions. So this is important to specify. The second aspect, and this is also related to my job in that white papers, I agree with Patrizia on the term propinquity rather than proximity, because the other point that we stressed was the role of digital volunteerism. Okay, so digital volunteers are very important during during crisis and disasters. They are supportive, even though they live thousands of miles away. Sometimes they are very emotionally involved in the response to the disaster, and they help a lot actually in locating information, connecting people, this kind of stuff. So I would encourage you not to overlook this group, because they can certainly help, and they are present, even though if they are not visible, they are very present in times of crisis.
I couldn't agree more. Especially also what is interesting in some of the cases that we have, the digital precedes the real spatial proximity. So where you have somebody who is getting engaged, emotionally engaged to a case, and then moves into the situation. A lot of the students we had in the Aquila case study are in that case. They gain interest in the case on Facebook, and then later on turn out to be organizing camps. So yeah, I completely agree with you.
Great. And we might have time for one additional point before we take a break. But I see a bunch of links being shared on chat. So thanks a lot for those resources. Definitely papers and reports, etc., that we will be looking at. These look very interesting.
I have Patricia.
Yes, I do want to add one more thing that might be useful for you on the Japan case study. When you were talking about Japan and, again, the sort of sheer amounts of volunteers there that we see in Japan, right? I do unfortunately not remember the term anymore. I would have to go all the way back to my PhD. I had it there somewhere. But I would go out on a limb here and say I'd be very careful calling people in Japan that are not affiliated volunteers, because of that whole shift that happened in Japan. And Serena, who worked with David Alexander, who is somebody who we both know and who worked a lot in Japan on these sort of issues. I think she will second that too. In Japan, you had a shift of civic duty in terms of disasters becoming really, something that's internalized as individual responsibility, right? It's a national, it's a culture, if you want. Okay, there is a specific term even for it. There are two. There's one that is called animism, but it's different. But then there's a specific Japanese term, and I really don't remember what it is. And so there is a duty in Japan to step up and act. And you can now come, with philosophical arguments and wonder, well, is that really volunteerism, right? Or is that pressure or duty or whatever it is? But can we really call that volunteering or volunteerism or whatever you want? Really, really interesting in the case of Japan. So maybe that helps explain a few things in the specific case.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the point we wanted to make, is that culture matters. That is that we could go to a specific place and have specific conditions. So yeah, I completely agree with that. This is and this idea of internalized values that makes you do things, and where it would be stigmatized to not act, should be
precisely
a social stigma.
Precisely that. Yeah,
I think it's really interesting, because we assume somehow that it is easier to not do something than to do something, but often this is not the case.
Yeah, and we also, we also assume on a similar note, we also assume often that, in the literature at least, when you look at papers on community response, community-based initiatives, we often assume that these are, the connotation is a good one, right? Community is that sort of la-la land of, happy, joy, and everybody is, loves each other and so on. We forget to look at the dark sides of community, and by the same token of informal disaster response or spontaneous volunteerism or whatever it is. And by I don't mean, the formal disaster governance actors coming and raising the fingers and saying, no, because you are not liable, and legally there are issues. I don't mean that. I actually mean really, power dynamics, let's say, within those informal structures, right? We saw that in Rios. We saw that during the refugee crisis, right, where you had a huge formal response on what's the island above Rios, Lesbos, right? You had everyone there, but the island just underneath, Rios, had pretty much nobody there. And the whole response there was entirely informal, okay? And you really see how within 2 months, I think less than that, you had informal volunteers having turf wars over who helps the refugees first, okay? So just really interesting to look into those, let's say, dark sides of informal action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you, Carl, for your chat message. It's another food for thought. I would agree with you. Something to take in account, but it links back to the question of to what extent reciprocity plays out, and to what extent some specific contextual conditions are the explanatory factors for why people act. Yeah.
Thank you, Manuela. I think that this is also something that we have to think about, and I'll close on that. But it's that our cases, might frame also the way we think about volunteering and actor or spontaneous actors or volunteers. So we'll have to be quite careful about that aspect. What I suggest is that we now take a break and make it slightly shorter than what I had promised in the beginning, 5 minutes, because we had the great conversation, and then we'll start the second part with basically Jan will come back and talk about the model of societal resilience. So really a model that will help us discuss further actually some of the insights from those case study analysis. So talk to you in 5 minutes at 20. Okay, maybe we can start soon. We're going to wait for Jan, of course.
I will share my other presentation.
If you're able to take a little bit of a break and a glass of something, water or something, to re-energize.
Are we
Right.
Are we back?
Yeah, I think we can start.
Okay, so well, welcome back. Hope you could take a bit of break. This second part is much shorter and is much more, but even more maybe, going to be the basis of discussion. The idea of this model is to bring the different things together that we saw in the presentation at the beginning by Matthew. So we have the cases, so we have empirical data that's provided, and we need some concepts to deal with it. That's where the discussion on voluntarism comes in very handy. And then the idea is to come towards a model which helps us to understand how this relates to societal resilience, which is our guiding concept. And also, since we're doing applied research, well, it has to fit into our idea to make a catalog of solutions and solutions that enhance interactions between those official, so formal disaster managers and the informal ones. So the idea was to bring 4 building blocks together. You already saw or heard during my presentation the idea that we are focusing on actions, what people do, and we call them also a little bit, for lack of a better term, coping actions. Coping actions works in this sense quite well because it is not focusing very much on a distinction between volunteers, victims, professionals, etc. It's just people to cope with the situation, and that's why we believe it's a good term to capture the idea of how individual behavior and collective behavior can be bound back to societal resilience. Then we have a building block about the social context. We mentioned it. Culture matters. Specific conditions matters. A sense of a place matters. So it has to be also fit into it. Then we have our solutions, since we want to apply this model to our catalog, to our solution, to understand them better, in what way they can bring certain types of actions together. And finally, we have an overall definition of societal resilience, so this also have to fit into the model. So if we take those building blocks apart, and what could be meant by that? So the advantage of those coping actions would be that they encompass both individual and collective decision making. Everybody copes with the situation. And it makes it possible to think together and also insist on those non-professionals, on those informers, on those who are, not volunteering, but just acting, coping with the situation. But also lets us to take into account what disaster managers do and plan to do. This also matters, even though their actions are often not interdependent. But if we want to understand a certain situation, if we want to link those closer together, we have to think them together, even though they're, as we have seen with the case studies, often not interdependent. They coexist. And actions are socially situated. That's where the context comes in. And finally, those collective coping actions are thought to enable societal resilience. They they're not only limited to a specific place, they interact with all other coping actions and bring us further on. And if they interact well if official disaster managers enhance the societal resilience. Social context. What do we mean by that? Well, of course, everything is context. So we have to isolate specific factors that are particularly relevant in one case for enabling coping. So if we have those actions, we can go from those actions to what conditioned them, what made them possible. And this shows us how context matters. We can, for example, and this is one of the propositions, put them in this schematic, distinguishing between what is a condition that is structural, that is not appearing in the situation, but already has been there long before. That's why there's a time error, which is taking a place in the specific situation. It's conjunctural. For example, you could argue that social positions, profession somebody has, is somehow determined beforehand. And also some sense of community, be bad or good, is also somehow already structurally present before the crisis strikes. Capacities can be structural, but they can also appear in the situation. Because what is a capacity to cope is not necessarily thought as such beforehand. Knowing how to steer a boat on a lake in Norway is not necessarily something you would associate with disaster, but it can be handy when the situation and conditions come together. The same goes for something which we could call alertness, or which is sometimes called alertness. So the fact that you are situational aware and are willing to act on it. And of course, prior knowledge can be both. You can acquire or use knowledge you already have, which is structurally in you because you have exercised a certain profession, or because you have a certain link or know somebody from who has resources, or something that can come up in the situation. So this helps us a little bit to narrow down this big word of social context. So what do we speak about in specific situations, and how can we at least structure it a bit to come to a model? And then, of course, we have to think about what I mentioned earlier about solutions. Because we want to apply. This model has to be, well, not operational, but applicable at least. So we are looking for solutions that modify the interaction or create one between crisis professionals and citizens. That's the target of most of our applications, procedures, or what we understand as solutions. We'll dig deeper into that in the next part. And those solutions depend on contextual factors. The idea is that you cannot modify or create an interaction if you're not aware in what context this will happen. And this is also a plaidoyer, this model, if it works, for taking this serious, the context, the culture, the local conditions, the place. And that you can only target specific factors. Finally, what has this all to do with societal resilience? Well, the way we defined it is that it includes all types of social units, individuals and collective actors, people who act on a localized, very localized scale, but also, well, as we talked about in the case of Japan, a whole society. The idea is also that even though societal resilience as such, as a noun, seems to describe a state, it is, empirically speaking, always a process. And it's, in that sense, sensible for social context. It's dynamic and involves necessarily a perspective on social change. The idea is not to bounce back, but to bounce forward. It has to be precise because you have a lot of uses of resilience which are somehow blurry, not very clear. It's a buzzword as well, so a lot of people use it. A lot of political actors use it. So you have to have a precise definition of what we exactly mean, and it has to be empirically valid. And it does not shift away responsibilities because, as you know, the term of resilience has sometimes been criticized of focusing too much on what the unofficials do, the informals, and by the way, taking out the responsibility of the state. At least this criticism has been made a lot. So we have to have a notion of resilience that, yeah, brings together and does not shift away responsibility to one or to the other side. So this is the idea of building on that model. As you can see, and I purposely did so, it remains kind of vague because the idea was to discuss with you about it. So it's not already in a clear, strong form. So I can, and we can have your input about those different building blocks. Having said this, and having a little less time than before, we could start discussion. Do you have any remarks to that? Do you have any questions, or do you have any comments? Or maybe the more relevant questions, are you all back? Or are you still in break? You are back. That's reassuring.
If there's no comment, I think we can probably move on. But it would be interesting to think about how we could collect maybe some feedback once we have documents to share or something like that. Jan?
Yeah, very, very, very happy to share with you this in a written and more detailed form. And so any comment is welcome.
And we'll discuss that a little bit in the coming presentation from Yannick. Part of the ambition around the knowledge platform is to provide a number of resources, information, basically around these topics that we investigated in the project, and the model that Jan is referring to will be, one of such outcomes, and that will be part of the platform. So it will be made public, and it will be. We'll try to find ways to gather feedback via the platform, for example.
Yeah.
Then Yannick, please.
Yep, thank you. Is my sound good? Considering I had a test with Mathieu earlier today, and then the sound was crazy. But yeah, so my voice is a bit affected by illness, but so please excuse me in advance. But I'll do my best. So what I'll do in this session is to give a brief introduction to the knowledge platform and Catalogue solution, which is one of the project's products. So it will be a bit of a recap for those who are new to the Ki-CoP, so some repetition for those who are not new. But I'll mainly focus on what we've been done since Marseille and what we will keep on doing in this project when it comes to the knowledge platform and the Catalogue solutions. So first I'll address more what's really the purpose of the Catalogue solutions and knowledge platform, and then the added value. I will also use an example from the Trondheim Red Cross. Then I will address the main feedback from Marseille, which was the last Ki-CoP workshop we had, which was physical. And then I'll go into what we've done since Marseille and ongoing work and the way forward. So first, the purpose and added value of the Catalogue and the knowledge platform. So the main sort of information element that is on the knowledge platform at the moment is the Catalogue solution. So early it's perhaps been presented more as so to say a guideline or procedure for how to implement solutions that are intended to improve the interaction between the civil population, authorities, and emergency response actors. But what we sort of want the Catalogue solutions and the knowledge platform to be is more of an inspiration for doing things differently, finding things corresponding to the needs of end users. If you have a challenge with communication, with addressing citizens, making use of different resources, as well as provide information about context and allow users of the knowledge platform and Catalogue solution to be able to understand more than just the description of a solution, but more details of its function. So what you have in the Catalogue now is not exhaustive, but we collected a range of tools and practices from around the world. And the aim of these solutions, which also Mathieu mentioned in the beginning of this workshop, is to engage citizens in disaster management. So you want to sort of challenge people on how they think about emergency preparedness, or how you prepare for and handle disasters, and to inspire you. So the intended users of the Catalogue solution on the platform are practitioners and experts in their field. So we're not going to tell you what you should do in your situation, but provide information so you can make your own considerations. So I think that's an important message that we want to communicate with the knowledge platform and the Catalogue solution. and which we will continue to work on. So an example of a solution, also for those of you who are new to the Ki-CoP, we have a range of solutions. It can be apps, it can be procedures, it can be strategies or guidelines, etc. Where we most of them have basic information, but we are also in the process of in-depth characterizing them. That means that we are doing interviews with people who have developed the tools, who are using them, or citizens that have been involved. So it depends on it depends on the solution really, who we are targeting to interview, and also retrieve documents. So what you see here is really basic information, a short description, the purpose of the solution, and what the solution can help when it comes to the needs of first responders and authorities. But this is just a screenshot. But here's I see there's a question. I will address that. Oh, sorry. Afterwards. Then we have also purpose and outcomes for those we have in-depth characterized. Then we have guidelines, which includes which factors that have been considered as important for implementation, and which factors that have been considered important for using the solution. And then we also include information about lessons learned, which are evaluation that has been done. So all the solutions in the catalog are implemented solutions that are solutions that are used somewhere in the world. So here we also have challenges they have faced in their own context. So is it in Australia? Is it in Norway, Israel, in France, Belgium, or in multiple countries, but also what is considered requirements. So these requirements, these challenges are from people we have been interviewing and documents. So I can address the question that's in the chat. So who should I turn to considering editing info on the knowledge platform? So we don't have a sort of feedback function on the knowledge platform at the moment, which we could consider. Else it will be to contact the project. Yeah, and Mathieu has posted the link to the knowledge platform if you want to have a look. But if you want to edit info on the knowledge platform, you'll have to contact the project, David. But we also want to, which I will address later with Mathieu, is that we want to make a form if you know of a solution that we do not have in Catalogue, which you want to propose. We want to make an option for that as well.
Can I ask you, David, can I ask you the motivation for your question?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually managing the hard drive system, which is mentioned here as a Danish platform, which is a bit errors. But so I would like to edit the information about my own projects on the platform.
Correct.
That's the
Okay.
question.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
so this would be indeed perfect for us. One thing that Yannicka will mention also is that when we do these in-depth characterization, we do that when we have the contact of people who are directly involved or know directly those. So that would be an example where we can work together on improving the content and correcting the content when there are mistakes. Indeed.
Another part, David, is also a review process that is ongoing to make sure that the content is correct. But of course, challenge is that information is quickly outdated. So the more detailed we get, I described the solution which just completely changed their website. It was a resource platform. So my description didn't fit anymore, and the reviewer is like, did something happen in between your description and me reviewing it? So yes, they just changed the whole website. So this is also a challenge that we are facing and are addressing in the project. But David, let's keep in contact to make sure that the information is correct. Thank you. So an example by Trondheim Red Cross, what do we mean about to challenge, to inspire? So a part of the Engage is also to have exercises, and one of them will be held in Trondheim. It's a landslide exercise. And one solution that the Trondheim Red Cross, which is a local branch that we have in the catalogue, but that was also a part of not necessarily the project, but it's the Red Cross Preparedness Guard, which is a solution from the Red Cross. But the Trondheim Red Cross has been very skeptical in implementing this because it did not really, they had to modify the needs, and they were concerned that they couldn't follow up. But so they've been now implementing this solution because they realized perhaps there could be something here that can actually address a need that we have. So they've used a year now to implement this, and it's going very well. But they were at first very skeptical, but then they saw that perhaps by modifying it and doing it according to their needs and their organization structure locally, it could work. They've also had a look at the Be Ready caravan that I just showed. That is a training campaign from Romania. So they have a actual truck that's been built, which drives around Romania to give courses, quite short courses and videos to the population about earthquake. So it's a training campaign on wheels. And the Trondheim Red Cross find this very interesting, but they don't have the resources right now to buy a whole truck. But the sort of the idea of giving small courses to citizens in schools or in local areas with the idea of Be Ready Caravan is something that they would need, and they actually combined it with the Red Cross Preparedness Guard, because the search and rescue people in the Red Cross, they are out on mission quite often, so they are keeping updated on what they should do, while the Red Cross Preparedness Guard are more people with fewer courses, and they're more focused on psychosocial tasks. So it will be important to find something for the Red Cross Preparedness Guard members to have something to do during the day or the year. So they are looking into the possibility to have them giving, for example, landslide courses or first aid courses to school classes or elderly homes or etc. And the next or the last example is Dofomoa, which also is a Romanian solution. It was extensively developed during Ukraine refugee crisis after the invasion from Russia in February. So this is a support platform for refugees where people and organizations can sign in if they want to help with housing, with transport, with food, with clothes. And there's also a resource platform for the authorities to keep track on what is proposed. So this is just not exactly what the Red Cross in Trondheim needs, but something similar or to be inspired by. So what we did, we just had an exercise in Trondheim, 12th of November, where the Trondheim Red Cross tested out the Trondheim Preparedness Guard for the first time. And in advance, they did the Be Ready Caravan course, but with a landslide topic instead and beforehand. And then we at Sintef made a mock-up of the Dofomoa resource platform that we introduced into the exercise, where the Trondheim Red Cross could, as a mock-up, test to see if such a platform could be useful. So we had the Trondheim Red Cross Preparedness Guard is in the white vests, and the search and rescue team are in yellow and orange vests. So it was very interesting during this exercise to see the dynamics between the two groups, because they are supposed to be complementary, helping each other, but they are quite, the Preparedness Guard is a new element. And also we had observations role from Engaged there to see also how the resource platform idea functioned. So really Trondheim Red Cross is really taken on board many of the solutions, but also really it's not about implementing a solution just as it's been used in Romania. It's about being inspired, thinking a bit differently, and modifying it really to your own needs and your own organization. I see there are some comments, but Mathieu is continually answering, so that's then I'll just move on. Thank you. So feedback, must say. So it's really 3 points I want to highlight. So one is there's a diversity of needs among you in the Ki-CoP. So some, after having reviewed the catalog of solutions and giving a scenario, some of you found that to be too little information, while others found it to be too much information. It was difficult to navigate. So what we also see here is that there are very big or diversity in the needs of those we intend as users of the both knowledge platform and the catalog of solutions. So we would need to find sort of a balance between different needs. Some found it difficult to see the value of the catalog of solutions. At the time in Marseille, that was the spring this year, the content wasn't that mature. We didn't have much in-depth characterized solutions, so it was difficult to see where we wanted to go with the knowledge platform. And thirdly, the question arose, is such a repository useful? Could you foresee, or it was sort of the bigger question, if it's useful at all? So this has been a point of departure, which we've sort of taken in and discussed in the way forward. So what have we done since the feedback in Marseille? So first of all, we've started cleaning up and growing content. So there were we had a lot of solutions, but some that perhaps were not fitting in our catalog solution. So we did a cleanup, but also filling in more content, both basic information, but also in-depth characterizing solutions. We had a review process started this summer, which is partially ongoing to ensure content quality. So for the in-depth characterized solution, which is more information, more intricate, we have 2 reviewers. So it's a one end user reviewer in our project. So for example, the Trondheim Red Cross or ASL or Cita Initiativa, or DSU from Romania, and we have one academic partner as a reviewer. So we have 2 reviewers going through the content, giving feedback, and then we are reviewing it. And what we are doing now is also reviewing the basic information, just to make sure that everything is in order there as well. That's less information, but still important that we, as David pointed out, when we have something wrong, so we need to ensure that the content quality is good. And we have also had several discussions on the usefulness of such a source. Among other things, we've had a face-to-face workshop in Paris in the consortium. So that's where we sort of landed, where the catalog is more and the knowledge platform as an inspiration, a source of inspiration more than a recipe for how to implement one specific solution like this, and this. But all this is work in progress, which we will continue. And what more, we're also now have begun and will continue working on technical features and visualization. We know that we have a lot of content, but we would like more visualization, not just heavy text, and also different ways of filtering when you enter the catalog. We want to link the information in the catalog of solution with other content of the knowledge platform. So as you see here, there are different tabs. We want to populate or link the information that is here with the content of the different solutions, but we also want to extend the knowledge on the knowledge platform. So we are doing work on informal solutions. So we foresee to have a subsection here with informal solutions, perhaps not by that name, and also with the findings from the case studies that Jan was presenting to you, that we should find a place under the societal resilience and in connection with the model, for example. And also address the idea of context. That's one thing, the contextual factors that we have been talking about during this workshop and previous, that we are also trying to identify those in the solutions that we are in that characterizing, but also in the case studies, and try to connect the dots here. So that will be sort of a challenge, but also what is really rewarding and more novel is if we can highlight the more analytical and the cross-border and try to link the content to create new knowledge. Yes, I don't know, Mathieu, do you want to add something? Or others from the consortium? Of course, there are a lot of things that are ongoing, but to highlight some of it. So what I can perhaps say is that the visual is perhaps not that changed from Marseille. It's really the content, and then we're working on both the content and the visualization now and onwards. And we're also, the last point, I'm just keeping that to last on purpose. We will continue further in-depth characterized solutions. And for that, we would really love to have the help of the Ki-CoP to help us choose which solutions we should in-depth characterize next, because we have 60 solutions that have only basic information, and we can't in-depth characterize 60 solutions at once. We need to have some form of prioritization, and we would love your help with that. So I'll stop sharing, and then Mathieu, you can share your screen.
Yep. Let me do that correctly.
But I can also ask if there are some unclarities, if someone has any questions to what I just said, or feedback. Yes, sustainable. It's a good question, Carl. So that's also something we're working on. What will happen when Engage is finished next year? So we're looking at different plans. Sorry, I just need to have something to drink. So the best will be to have someone to take over, to keep it sustainable, because as I mentioned also with David, that the information can be easily outdated. But we need to find one willing to do that. Another option is that we don't need necessarily someone to take over the whole platform as it's been coded, but we can also extract the information and transfer that to some other platform or merge it. Oh, sorry, people. And but also a sort of a backup will be to really highlight what we can analyze across the case studies, across the solutions that are not detail specific.
I think, Yannick, I should relieve you.
Yeah, I think you need to take over because my voice is cracking. Yeah, thank you.
But thank you for making it to the presentation. Yeah, I mean, I can only emphasize the same thing as Yannick relative to this sustainability. This is something that we are fully aware of, and it's a difficult question when the projects, one of the main outcomes is something like a knowledge repository. So we're working on it. That's part of the big topics of next year, together with the validation. But the bottom line is, and it's one of the motivations for having something like the Ki-CoP is that there are lots of people out there, and you're part of that group that have a lot of knowledge about these topics, and also very specifically about some of the solutions, including in your case, David, being the people behind the solutions. So it's important for us to find ways to interact with you more directly and have your input, not just feedback from time to time and a thumbs up or a thumbs down, but something a bit more active. So here are some ideas that we have. I would like to discuss specifically in this topic of collaboration. So one specific form of collaboration would be providing, helping us with input to the catalog of solutions or to the knowledge platform in general. What Yannick was talking about was prioritizing. So I will go back to the knowledge platform. You might have seen, if you look at the catalog of solutions, you have about 65 solutions or so. And you can check here to look at those that are in-depth characterized. So you have half a dozen that are in-depth characterized, that is, for which there is a significant amount of work, whether it's in documents, but also interviews of people that have experience with the solutions, in order to describe in great details, they basically provide the elements that Yannick provided, explained before. Right. So this in-depth characterization is a lengthy process, and we want to, at this point, what we would like to do is, out of all of the solutions that we have started working on, are there some that really stand out as those we should concentrate on because they are particularly relevant to a group of experts that you represent. So what we are doing is basically we would like to, and this is a prototype, so it will look maybe slightly different, but the basic idea is here. This is the list of all of the currently the solutions that currently have only basic descriptions. So it's a partial view of the information we have, but with the basic information of title, description, etc. And the idea is that this link is going to be shared with you. And so we're working, once again, it's a prototype. We're working on the exact interface, but you would select, for example, this Heartbeat Now solution, and then basically go to a form in which you can, for example, say from your perspective, this is a highly relevant solution, and actually it's something that you know something about. So you check this box and indicate your email, and maybe you add some comments that you indicate your email so that we can come back to you and, for example, conduct an interview in which we collect information, and then you add some comments. Right. And so the idea is then once many of you start doing this, we will be able to sort of classify the group of solutions that have basic description and see those that have been we don't expect that every single one of you will go through every single solution. So just to be clear, but it's like, by looking at the list, if there are some that you find particularly interesting, please, consider indicating that you find them relevant, and that you would like, for example, to see them described in greater detail. So that's one example of interaction.
Well, you said it,
Hmm?
Mathieu, but yeah, the point is not to rank all the solution, but to
No.
just skim through, and the ones that you find really interesting, you just go in and leave your more remarks or stars. But yeah, it shouldn't be take too much time.
Yeah.
But it really a great help to us.
Just to show you how it look, then this little thing I created means now we're gonna have a table basically on our side with, you know, for a specific solutions, you know, basically the kind of feedback we've received and potential propositions to help. David, what you were referring to, I mean, what you were pointing out, these potential issues. I mean, we could also have a simple form like that would simply be useful to indicate, you know, I know this solution, you know, there's a mistake there. So we could have simply the list of all the solutions, and you know, you can, for example, sort by title and you know, find the solution that you're familiar with or you are interested in, and yeah, so yeah, and then propose a correction or something like that. So we'll develop another form of similar kind, but for a different purpose. Going back to this, before I another one that we're working on is, you know, simply suggesting solutions. This is something we need internally for partners to, when they, you know, come across an interesting paper or interesting piece of news or a discussion with somebody, you know, to suggest new solutions that we have not identified in the initial part. And so same here, the idea would be to use so this is another form, basically, in which we will share those links with you in the coming weeks, so that you can start populating basically, and this form would be, you know, corresponds to a number of fields that we're interested in, that actually corresponds to what we find in the basic descriptions of the solutions. So the name, the, you know, a description, more or less long description, and then some links potentially, etc., etc. So maybe some categories that you can think of, like for example, yeah, some categories. This one was not a good example, but the category of purpose, for example, so purpose of enhancing preparedness as an example. And so forth. So not a huge amount of information necessarily, and not none of those, apart from a name and maybe a short description, nothing obligatory, but basically a simple form in which you can suggest solutions. And then finally, Yannicka mentioned the informal solutions. We are in the process right now in the project internally to create a sort of basic structure, much less complex than the one we're using for the solutions, but really have a little bit of structure to describe some of these informal solutions we have identified. And I think in the near future, this is also something we would like to invite you to contribute to. So by informal solutions, you know, we came across, for example, either solutions that were developed by first responders or those kinds of communities, but also sometimes by the population itself. I mean, there are plenty of examples of this during the COVID situation, for example, groups that emerged to support each other and in different ways. So those kinds of informal solutions that are not basically part of an official platform or an official set of resources are of great interest to us, and we would like to include that into the knowledge platform. So any kind of, is there any kind of comment you might have, any kind of suggestion you might have? Do you think this is, I mean, we don't want to burden you with a lot of work. It's just a matter of if you have the desire to contribute, is to create those kinds of mechanisms for you to provide input. So are there things that you think could be valuable also? And does it make sense? Yes, Patricia?
after this comment, I will be persona non grata here after
No,
speaking so
no,
much.
absolutely not.
Listen,
No, it's great.
first of all, I'm delighted to see that, because so much research on that topic, you know, does excellent work at conceptualizing, but then it ends there, right? So I'm really excited to see, as you call it, a catalog of concrete, actionable solutions, right? To use your term. And I think this is really, really important to operationalize, you know, to operationalize disaster risk, you know, reduction and response that includes that informal dimension. Okay, we really need those examples. The question that I have is a wider one, and that is, and it's a concern, it's a question and a concern. And that is that, you know, you can have the best catalog of solutions, but how do we actually make sure that people on both sides, informal and formal, take to it, right? How do we, to be concrete, how do we communicate this research in a way that, you know, in the public sphere, in the civil actors sphere, creates a sort of shift for people to, you know, to go away from the mindset of formal disaster governance as the Deus ex machina, okay, and vice versa. How do we create a mind shift in formal disaster governance, away from we are the superheroes that come into a disaster and everybody, you know, just move away, or there's some tokenized knowledge exchange and that's about it, to service to what is already there, to service to those informal responders, to true collaboration. Do you see what I mean? How do we create systemic change in which then your catalog of solutions actually becomes a resource, as I think Carl wrote in the comment, and I really agree. This is, you know, he wrote that, you know, you have a great resource developing here. So I really think that too. But how do we create a systemic change?
That's a tough question, because you're correct. It's a systemic change that you are referring to. The good thing is that, you know, not everything is on our shoulders. There are things happening around. No. But for example,
offering the ultimate solution here to this whole issue.
No, but I mean, this is part of the observation that that led to the project. You know, frameworks like the Sendai framework and the United Nations type of frameworks. They start getting into that kind of language of, you know, the communities are also actors of disaster resilience and so forth, right? So the shift is happening, I think. Now. One of the things we're doing in the project is also to work at that sort of policy level. We want to, and like our other projects from the DRSO1 cluster, we all have some kind of activity at where we try to be active in the policy level. So our colleagues at ENA, especially for Engage and other partners in other projects, are working on those aspects. But I agree. It's a mind shift and it's a perspective shift that is required, which is something that is very long and very tedious to obtain. But there's on our side, one of the things that we have to be, and that's very related to the question of sustainability of such a resource, is really our big efforts are going to be around, you know, making those kinds of resources visible during the life of the project, but also after, and finding venues or finding other areas in which it can stay alive and visible after the project, which is a difficulty in general. Yeah. I see that there are some comments. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a question from Carl. Yeah, so the question is whether there are costs or charges by using the solutions. And for some there will be, because there are public warning systems, for example, or there can be apps, so you need to have a developer or have it in your native language, for example. But some are strategies and some are for which you can sort of implement by using the information. But these are not really these are solutions that we have collected from around the world, so we are describing them. So you're correct, but we won't have this cost you $20 or euros a month, for example. But you try to indicate how resource intensive it is. For example, having a social media strategy, how many people you should have employed to handle a social media account, for example. So yes, there are some indications, and yeah, but we have very different types of solutions. So it depends on the solution how much cost there are involved. But when it comes to apps or something like that, there will be a cost by implementing it or using it. I hope that was an answer to your question.
Yes, that was brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay,
that also
good.
opens up an avenue for getting revenue streams in. If you take a cut from those, which
Yeah,
will
we can't do that because it's not our solutions. We just found them via the Ki-CoP and so on. So we are trying not to be promoting certain types. We are interested in those who are targeting the interaction between the civil population and authorities and first responders.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, from our standpoint, from the standpoint of the project, the knowledge platform, the catalog of solutions, will be available as basically freely, and through Creative Commons type copyright or something like that. So we plan to exploit such a resource, but as part of our own research or our own operational activities for the end users, not as a direct commercial product. But it might refer to commercial products in a few instances, not so many of them, but there are some instances. Any other question relative to what we discussed and potential ways of collaborating with us directly in providing input? Because otherwise, I wanted to mention also some of the things we have in mind for next year, especially some events and some physical events even. So these are all what I'm going to talk about is under preparation. So there's some uncertainty about dates, location, but this is what we have in mind, and this is what basically we want you to already start thinking about if you're interested in joining. So the first one is so we would like to have a physical workshop again, like what we did in Marseille this year in April. What we are targeting at this point is the series, which some of you know, which is used to be called the community of users. So it's a community of stakeholders that is managed by the European Commission around the projects, and they are thinking about having a 2 days of meeting in Toulouse in May around disaster resilience and around a variety of communication to the public around those kinds of topics. And we've been discussing, especially with Links, so sister project, in order to potentially have basically maybe a full-day workshop together. So that full-day workshop could be, on a particular day, and then you could come and join us for that workshop, and then you would stay basically for the series event the next couple of days in in Toulouse. So that's something we're discussing right now. We have a meeting with Links later this week, so we'll know more in the coming weeks. But that's something we have in mind. One of the things is that the meeting in Marseille was very nice and very useful, but it was also fairly short. It was also only half a day. So we would like the next time to have a bit more time and probably a full day to better interact. So that's one event. The other type of event is, as I was mentioning, we will have 4 exercises next year that we are currently planning. Not all of them are necessarily very conducive to having external guests because they don't necessarily happen on a specific day. I'll take a clear example. The exercise in Italy is based on heat wave. So basically, the exercise will happen across the summer. It will not be on a specific day. So it has a different dynamic basically than other exercises. But we are targeting especially 2 exercises that will be either tabletop or full-scale exercise. So full-scale exercise in Trondheim. And the shape of the one in Romania is not exactly clear at this point, but we're planning on it. It's probably going to be a tabletop. And so those could be opportunities to also have Ki-CoP being present and basically being observers. So we would be happy to welcome you around those exercises. There is, of course, the language barrier for such being able to observe. But my colleague Martina, who's online, and myself, we have been recently in another project, in another exercise, and we found ways around it by using narrators, by using interpreters, etc., to basically provide a sense to external observers about what's going on. This is going to be useful for ourselves in the project because, of course, we are not all, fluent in Romanian or in Norwegian, and so for our own partners to be able to observe, it will be useful to have those kinds of mechanisms in place. So, if that happens like that, then it would be natural to invite Ki-CoP also to come and observe and have exchanges with us around those exercises. So this is going to be more around mid 2023. And the last one is in preparation also with our sister project Links, because we are finishing around the same time. They finish a month before us, but we are around the same dates. And so we are looking at organizing in November at a location that will be determined later, but probably something that is relatively central, so that it's easy to reach for many people. And so we will have a final event, which is a way to basically present our final results and then discuss them. The idea of such a final event is not just to be one direction, but really to have discussions around the results and have maybe more interactive kind of sessions around panels and so forth. There will be also another series event at the end of the year in which we might simply do a shorter reporting. But for all of those events, the focus will be likely on Engage and Links, but we will certainly also invite other DRSO. And so I know that our friends from Risk Pack are online, so they will also be invited to participate and present. Have some room to present some of their work. Yeah, so this is you will hear more from us, but in the coming weeks you will hear about potential ways to help us with providing input to the catalog of solutions, whether it's prioritization or suggestions or corrections to solutions, and then as we make progress in the planning of those events, you will will inform you about opportunities to join us and come and observe and come and discuss, etc. Any kind of questions? Any kind of ideas? Other things you would like to see that you don't see here? One of the I'll just say last thing, but one of the things that we want to do with these physical meetings is basically to have something that's attractive, so people want to come. And we've done in April, we did it in the context of organizing in parallel with the conference, and I think many of you appreciated that. But it creates other constraints in terms, for example, of the amount of time we can spend together. These are, these would be slightly different kind of events, more where we can have a bit more in-depth discussions. Yes, Dieter?
Just one question. The May 23 in Toulouse, is that already fixed, the date, or is that only?
No.
Oh, it's not yet fixed. Okay.
No, the Philippe Covovillier, who's the person from the Commission who is organizing this, is it's in the planning phase still on their side as well. So, but he's progressing, but it's not completely finalized.
Okay, thanks.
Any other comment or question? If not, then I'm happy to let everybody go, and thank you for your patience and your interest. And thank you also to Jan and Janneke for their presentations. And happy to hear from you by email, and you will definitely hear from us fairly soon, and probably before the holiday. Okay, then have a great rest of the day.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.